About 28 years ago, almost exactly, my good friend Matt was the youth pastor of the church here, and my wife and I had just started attending. We'd been here for a year or so, and we said, okay, we'll help you out with the youth group. And we took the youth on a retreat to Lake Ossipee up in New Hampshire, and we decided, because the guys were really annoying the girls a lot, which is unusual, we said, let's take the guys for a hike. And so we threw them all in the van, and we drove a little ways, and there was a hike. It's supposed to be a couple hours up a mountainside there by Lake Ossipee, and at the top, there's supposed to be these spectacular views of the lake and the surrounding mountains and area, and it's supposed to look great. I don't know, because I never got to the top, because about halfway up, maybe about an hour into the hike, there was a stream, and we all decided to stop and just take a break at the stream. And a bunch of the boys started playing in the stream, throwing rocks. Why do guys like throwing rocks in streams so much? Throwing rocks, making mud balls and throwing mud balls. And we did that for a while because we're guys. And then after a bit of time, Matt's like, all right, guys, we need to get going. We want to get to the top, before it gets late and dark and all that stuff. But half of them didn't want to keep hiking. Half of them wanted to just stay there playing at the stream. So Matt took the ones who wanted to hike, and I stayed back with the ones who wanted to play in the mud. And they hiked, and we played in the mud for a while, and then that got old and dirty and boring, and it's the middle of the woods, and mosquitoes in the middle of the woods on a hot summer day. It's frustrating. But by the time we decided we were done with the stream, it was way too late for us to try and catch up with the guys who were hiking, because by the time we were catching up to them, they'd be coming back. So we just hiked back down to the parking lot. But I didn't have the keys for the van. Matt had the keys for the van. So we just sat there hanging around the concrete asphalt parking lot for an hour or two, waiting for them to come back. And when they came back, they were, guys, you missed it. It was so awesome. It was so cool. And they were telling us about this incredible time they had up on the top of this climb, this mountain, where they got an incredible view, and they took time up there to pray, to worship God. They had a real encounter with God up there together, and a special time that was just so restful in a way that those of us who stayed back just didn't know. We had gotten a rest. We had rested there at the stream for a while. We had rested at the asphalt parking lot for a while, but we didn't know the rest that they knew, the rest that came at the end of the hike, where they sat in that place and got to see that view and that perspective. There's a rest that we get from quitting, and there's a rest that we get from persevering, and they are nothing alike. And I've seen this same thing play out in many people's faith. In my own life, I've seen it play out. We hear Jesus invite us to come to him. He makes old things new. He takes the ashes of our lives. He makes something beautiful out of it. We hear his invitation to bring our weariness, our heavy burdens, and lay them down at his feet. And we start following Jesus. We taste that rest that he gives us, but it's an effort. It's work. Following Jesus, and we wonder, where's the rest? How long is it going to take to get there? We start to get disillusioned. We start to get hard-hearted, and we decide, it would be easier to just stop here and play in this stream. Life is full of a lot of different little streams, isn't it? Other places to just stop and say, this looks restful. I can't keep going. And we quit early. And we get distracted and settle for a rest that doesn't really satisfy. In all kinds of stuff. You can think of the obvious things, like you start taking rest in alcohol and you get caught in alcoholism. You start taking rest in drugs. But there's also taking rest in people's opinion of you. There's so many ways you and I find, I couldn't even list them all, of looking for rest in other places, settling for rest that doesn't satisfy. And the author of the passage we're about to read today from the book of Hebrews, a letter in the New Testament, was desperately concerned about Christians who were going through really difficult times, seeing some of their friends in prison, beaten, killed, cut in half. And he was really concerned about them quitting and not entering into God's rest. And so he wrote these words to encourage them and us to do everything you can to enter God's rest. So if you're in our app, just open up the app and you can follow along. If not, you can follow on the screen or turn to Hebrews chapter 3. I'm going to read just a portion of chapter 3, verses 12 to 14. Then I'm going to read a little bit of chapter 4. It's too much to read all of it. So here we go. Chapter 3 of Hebrews, starting in verse 12. He says, "See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. But encourage one another daily, as long as it's called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. We have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original conviction firmly to the very end." Going to chapter 4. "Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did." The "they did" there, let me pause for a second. He's talking about the people of Israel when God rescued them from Egypt. And many of them, as they're going through the wilderness, he's given them rest from slavery, leading them to rest in the promised land. And they don't like the hike. And so they turn their backs on God, start looking for rest in other places. And that's who he's talking about. They didn't enter his rest. So verse 2 again of chapter 4, "We've heard the good news proclaimed to us just like they did, but the message they heard was of no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed." You've got to respond to that message, that call to rest with faith. And then verse 9 of chapter 4 says, "There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us, therefore, make every effort, strive to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience." How are you doing this morning at getting God rest? Do you have God rest? Do you feel like your soul is living in God's rest? Has God's rest penetrated your soul, and is it transforming and changing the way you live life, the way you work, the way you interact with family and friends? Are you living out of a place of God's rest inside of you, with this sense you're being drawn into and moving toward God's perfect and ultimate rest? Is that how you're experiencing life? Or are you caught up on the wheel like everyone else? Are you distracted like everyone else? Not finding or taking rest in God, but looking in all these other places, death scrolling, looking for something that'll just give you that sense of, but it doesn't come. Some of you are wondering, well, where is God's rest? One of the first questions, one of the main questions he tries to answer is, where is God's rest? I'm a Christian. I've been a Christian for a long time, some people will say. And I don't feel like I have God's rest. Is it only for like someday after this world and the new creation, then I'll have God's rest? Where is it? Where do I find God's rest? I skipped a chunk of chapter 4 because it would be too much to read, and it's very confusing the first time you read it. But if you study chapter 4, let me try and break down his line and how he explains to them where to find God's rest and where you're not going to find God's rest. He starts by calling everyone's attention back to Genesis, back to the beginning, when God rested after finishing his work of establishing the earth as his temple, bringing order and beauty where there was no order, creating. We often fail to understand the importance of that statement, God rested. And for many, it's just the reason to say, so we should take a break now and then. As though God needed to, after that, sixth day, like, I am so exhausted. Barely got any sleep all week. That was so much. I just got to kick back and relax and fall asleep under this tree and 10 hours later wake up. That's not what God did. That's not what it's telling us. The whole creation story there in Genesis is telling us that God established the earth as his temple, the place where he would dwell, he would live, where he would rule and reign over it. And so at the end of this creation, where he has established his rule and reign, he has put his image in this temple, humanity. Right? All this stuff is all pictures that they would have understood, the people he's writing to at the beginning. And then he sits down to rest, to rule, to inhabit. Sitting down is an act of power and presence, not exhaustion. God's resting here is moving in to be present in this world, to enjoy and exercise dominion over it and all that happens in it. And we were invited into that rest through Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve invited into God's rest, to enjoy that rest, to enter into the Garden of Eden and walk with God in God's presence, to walk in God's rest. But they chose to try and rule and reign, the same way you and I do, try and rule and reign our own lives on their own terms. And so they never entered God's rest. Then chapter 4 in the letter of Hebrews, he kind of skips from there up to Israel and all that Israel went through when God rescued them from slavery in Egypt, gave them rest from that slavery, was leading them through the wilderness to the promised land where there would be rest. And they didn't like the journey. They didn't like the hike. They didn't like the food or the sleeping accommodations. And they rebelled against God. And so what did God say? He said, you're not going to enter my rest. And so that generation never entered the promised land. It was the next generation that entered the promised land, led by Joshua. But even then, they were in that place. But did they enter God's rest? And he says, well, if so, then I don't understand why 400, 500 years later, King David would write a warning in Psalm 95 saying, be careful that you don't harden your hearts like they did, or we won't enter into God's rest. So David says that rest is still out there. Don't follow the bad example of those who get tired and give up and turn their backs on God and start looking for rest where everyone else is looking for rest, who start playing in the mud and the stream. Keep hiking, keep moving, because there's a rest still out there for God's people. God's rest wasn't in the garden. God's rest wasn't in the promised land. Guess what? You walked in the church this morning. God's rest isn't in this place. It isn't in a place. Well, then where is God's rest? Do you remember all the times Jesus had confrontations with the religious leaders around Sabbath rest and what to do on Sabbath day, where they firmly stuck to the rules of do not do anything on Sabbath day. It is a day for nothingness. It's a day not to do anything, and they were very strict about it. And in comes Jesus, this upstart, healing people and setting them free from disease and oppression and possession on Sabbath, the day of rest. And it all comes to a head in John chapter 5. We have this moment where Jesus is walking in Jerusalem, comes across a man who's been crippled for 38 years, and he's lying there on his mat next to this place where a lot of people were healed and where miracles happened. So this guy for 38 years would be there every day, lying on his mat, unable to move because he was crippled, hoping for a miracle. Jesus walks up to this man on a Sabbath day, looks at him and says, hey, stand up. Pick up your mat and walk. So the man did exactly what Jesus said. He stood up and he started walking around. 38 years, almost 4 decades, he hadn't been able to walk around. It's easy to not feel this stuff. Have you seen any of those videos of someone who was born deaf getting the cochlear implants and hearing for the first time? Oh, gosh, I want to cry right now thinking about some of those, like little babies or teenage girls. I've seen like these people who are able to hear their parents for the first time, their spouse for the first time, and it's like, oh my God, look what happened. 38 years, this guy couldn't walk. And now he's walking. And he's walking all over the place, and he picks up his mat, which was his mistake. He picked up his mat, and he let the religious leaders see him carrying his mat. And they didn't say, oh my goodness, how is it that you're healed? How are you walking? They said, why are you carrying your mat? It's Sabbath, day of rest. They're like, well, the guy healed me and told me to take up my mat. Who healed you? Who told you to pick up your mat? He tells them it's Jesus. So they go after Jesus. What are you doing, Jesus? Why are you breaking the Sabbath? Why are you breaking God's rest? And listen to what Jesus' response is. Listen to how Jesus defends himself. So John chapter 5, verse 16 says, so because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, my Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working. What's Jesus' defense? God the Father is breaking the Sabbath? God the Father entered his Sabbath rest, but he's working to this very day. He rested from all his creative work. He's still resting to this very day, but also working to this very day. So please don't mind me if I'm healing people and giving them God's rest on the Sabbath day, the day of rest. I'm just doing what my Father is doing. God has been working to bring us rest. Jesus came to bring God's rest to us. Where do we find rest? Rest finds us. Rest came looking for us. God has been working throughout time and space, and ultimately through Jesus to bring rest to us. God wants to put rest inside of us so that we can then live out of that place of rest and follow Jesus all the way, persevering until we enter that final and eternal rest with him forever and ever. Think about Jesus' famous invitation. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke on you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Where do we find rest? In Jesus. Already, today, that rest can enter you. And if we accept Jesus' invitation, Jesus makes it possible for rest to enter us so that we can live out of that rest and follow him, persevering all the way through to that day of ultimate rest in God. But what does that rest look like? Okay, so I have Jesus' rest, so what? Can you tell? Can you see it? What does it look like? What is this rest? Once you've accepted Jesus, do you just float through life on a cloud? A lot of people get discouraged and angry because they think that's what it's supposed to be. I'm a Christian. Why would this happen to me? Why would I have to struggle and persevere? I follow Jesus. Where's my cloud? Take me through. We even think, and some of us teach and preach this way, that eternity is a whole lot of just doing nothing. That it's just do nothing. Rest means do nothing. That's not what rest is, not God rest. It can't be do nothing because look at what God is doing during his rest. He's working to this very day to bring us rest. Then look again at Jesus' invitation. Come to me and I will give you rest. Goes hand in glove with what? Take my yoke on you. Come to me, I'll give you rest. Take my yoke on you. What's that yoke? The thing that the animals wear that holds them to each other. Take my yoke. Rest and work. There's a tension. These are going hand in hand. Enter my rest and join me in the work I'm doing of bringing God's rest. In Revelation, when it pictures this life that we're looking forward to, in Revelation 5:10, it says, you have made them to be, God has made Christians, though followers of God, to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth. What are the two things we're doing? Serving, that's working, and reigning. God rest. The rest Jesus gives and the rest Jesus is leading us into is not an empty rest. It is a rest that is full and robust and active, and yet it's still rest. And I know that doesn't really sound like rest. That sounds like you're at the job site tomorrow and your boss comes and said, why don't you take a break from carrying all the heavy lumber? You need a rest. Carry the cement instead. That's not a rest. Or, hey, you know what? Take a break from doing all that paperwork. Take a rest from it and clean the men's room instead. This isn't rest. And so what is he talking about? And I think the rest of Hebrews chapter 4, he's trying to help us understand the tension between rest and effort. A rest we've received, a rest we will receive, and the effort and tension that we have to work through between those two. And he also gives us something to motivate us to keep going. Now, I'm going to do my best to explain what I think God's word is saying here through these last few paragraphs of Hebrews chapter 4. So go there to verse 9. This is what he says. He says, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. God did his creative work and rested, but continues to work to bring us rest and bring us into rest. Jesus came and brought us rest. But we still need to strive and make every effort to persevere until that ultimate rest When we come to Jesus, we receive that rest. But then those who rest put down their work, just like God put down his work. So what is this tension here? This is why people, again, get frustrated with God. Because we think, oh, come to him, rest, and then we stop. The rest Jesus gives us today. Here's his answer. What is this rest, then, that we're getting? Here's his solution for the tension. He says this in verse 12. For the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to the dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give an account. That clear it up for you? Or did that feel like he changed the subject? It feels like he changed the subject, doesn't it? But he didn't. Let me try to explain. When we encounter Jesus and his offer of rest, the works we get to put down, the works we stop doing, are all the works we do as slaves to try and earn our keep in this world. All the toil, all the strain, all the effort, the endless slave effort we put into making ourselves appear acceptable, appear admirable, appear deserving of the air we breathe and our place in this world, all this self-saving work that we're constantly doing to measure up, to fit in, to be accepted, to feel like we're okay and deserve what we've got. All that stuff that gets us nothing, but you know what it gets us in the end? Death. 100% of the time. We get to put all of that down. The stuff that drains you, your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. You get to rest from all of that, to stop trying to paint over your broken down body, your broken down life, to try and cover up all those areas that are rusted through or fractured or splintered or rotted. You get to stop trying to paint on all that stuff because Jesus sees through it anyway. And these verses that seem to come out of nowhere, they're telling us that God's word penetrates all the facade we put up, all that work we do to save ourselves and make ourselves look acceptable in this world, acceptable to God. We get to put all that down, and it doesn't matter because he sees right through it anyway. It makes you and me a slave. It makes us feel like we're never measuring up. We're always having to push and push and push. It's not going to stand up to God's scrutiny. He will see right through it. It dissolves beneath his gaze. He sees the truth behind it all. Even if you had everyone else in the world fooled, we're broken, we're weak, we're sinful. And that might make you despair, but don't despair. Let go of the futility of trying to self-save and all the work of trying to do all that stuff you and I do every day to try and keep our place, earn our place, get ahead, all that strain and stress. Put it down, and instead of doing all that to save yourself and save your life, rely on Jesus, which is why he next says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to this faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses. We have one who has been tempted in every way, just like we are, but he did not sin. So then, let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive God's mercy and grace to help us in our time of need. The rest that God offers us in Jesus is a rest from all the futile and frustrating and fruitless work we do to save ourselves. It's an invitation to allow Jesus to do that work for us because only he can. We could never do it. The wages we get, what we earn for it, is just death. Let Jesus mediate for you and bring you into God's presence, which is what do we find in God's presence? Rest. Rest. The grace we need to help us persevere, the help we need to persevere. You'll never, ever get that on your own. You'll never find that in any other thing, any substance, any person, any entertainment, any comfort. You'll never get it anywhere else. Only through Jesus. And from that place of receiving his rest and it entering me, I then take up his yoke. And I find that hiking this mountain with him doesn't become easy, but it's light. It's It doesn't mean I don't have to persevere and keep struggling, but his burden is light. All right, is that what you're experiencing? And if not, then you've got to ask yourself, have I really let Jesus' rest enter me? Am I really leaning on Jesus' rest? Or am I playing in mud puddles? What am I doing? When Jesus' rest enters us, his yoke goes on our shoulders. We no longer have to work to be acceptable. We get to work out of the joy of having been accepted. That is a transition in your life, a transformation in how you will see life. Are you getting that rest? Are you getting God rest? Some of you this morning really need to put aside. You're trying to find rest by living up to others' expectations, whether it's your boss or your parents or that just little tyrannical voice in your head. You may not even know where it comes from, but it keeps driving you. You got to keep going. You got to earn the ability to rest. Some of you need to hear Jesus' call to find rest in him and stop with that other stuff. And some of you this morning, you're in this place where it's a long journey and you've gotten frustrated and you kind of you realize you're just playing with rocks in the stream. Like, you know what? This is fun. Yeah, I know there's something awesome up there, but look at that. Isn't that cool? And that's fun for a while. And then we realize we're not getting anywhere. There's a van right there. We got no keys. We're not getting anywhere. And this morning, you may feel like, you may be realizing you've quit too soon and you're covered in that mud and you may begin to feel ashamed, but I want you to understand how Jesus looks at you. Jesus doesn't look at you with disgust or disdain. Jesus looks at you with empathy because he has been through all the temptations you and I go through. He became like us. That's that climax of this chapter there. Jesus was tempted in every way you and I are, but he didn't sin. Which means that Jesus has endured a temptation you and I can't even understand. You think, oh, but you don't understand how tempting it is to do this or do that. It's so hard. You and I have never resisted to the point where Jesus did. We give in to temptation long before it reaches its climax and pinnacle. Jesus resisted temptation all the way to the point of the cross, which means he's encountered a temptation you and I still don't really fathom. And as hard as temptation might be sometimes to give up, to try and find rest somewhere else, in something else, in someone else, remember Jesus and how he persevered for you to bring this rest to you. And if he did that, then he can do everything to help you endure and persevere all the way to that final rest. That's what he has for you this morning. Worship team, I'm going to ask you to make your way back. And as we celebrate communion this morning in a few moments, I want you to be thinking about Jesus' invitation this morning. I want you to be thinking about how he has invited you into his rest. And you have a decision to make today. We all have a decision to make today. Am I going to strive for that rest? Am I going to strive for him? Or am I going to settle for something less? Am I going to keep hiking toward Jesus through the difficulty? Am I going to keep pressing on? Or am I going to stop and just get caught up playing in the mud in the stream? What will you do today? That's a decision we've each got to make. And when we celebrate communion, what we're saying, we're declaring, Jesus, I'm going to follow you. I'm going to fight through the temptations. I'm going to endure and persevere and put my faith in you. I'm going to receive the rest you've given me and strive with you toward that rest, that ultimate rest. I'm committing to that. That's what communion is saying. So as we sing this song about what Jesus has done and the mighty cross and the power it has in our lives, I want you to be thinking about that decision you've got to make today. Are you going to persevere? Are you going to put your faith in him? Or are you going to shrink back? Let's sing it together.